In 1944, a U.S. fighter pilot was returning from a raid over Germany when a bright ball of light streaked by him at a blazing speed. A chill shot through him. At first, he thought it must be his imagination, but later reports from other pilots confirmed that his experiences were real. If these mysterious flying objects weren't hallucinations, what were they? Good evening and welcome to From Beyond. I'm Joey Travolta. During World War II, Allied pilots called the UFOs they encountered Foo Fighters. Far from worrying about these objects coming from outer space, they feared that they were part of the enemy's new arsenal. Was it possible? Were the Germans developing a secret new technology, advanced far beyond what the world had known?
The Germans during World War II built at least 5 types of things we would call flying saucers. Today, if we saw them in the sky, we would say they're UFOs. Of course, there's some debate and some mystery exactly how these things worked. Starting with the most basic, the Foo Fighters, what the British and Americans saw in the skies, the bomber formations saw coming up at them. Most researchers believe these were simply turbojets mounted with some little wing that rotated around like a helicopter rotor. This thing spun up at the enemy and was remotely controlled. Through emissions of their fuel and through electronic mechanism in the devices, they would attempt to short-circuit out the ignition systems of the bombers.
I was a young fighter pilot in World War II, and I was a captain in the Air Force near the end of the war. And we began receiving reports sometime in 1943 of Foo Fighters, fireball fighters. They were balls of brilliant light, sometimes brilliant green and sometimes brilliant orange light, sometimes the size of a basketball and sometimes much bigger, that would get in formation with our bombers and stay there.
The Germans built about 100 different models of UFOs, powered with every existing engine in the German arsenal. Internal combustion engines, piston engines, rotary vacuum engines, outboard and inboard turbojets, pulse jets, ramjets, outboard and inboard rocket engines, spinning magnetic fields, basically flying electric motors.
Probably next in line in technical ascendance is the Schreiber-Habermas projects in Prague. These were spinning tops, essentially. These were jet or rocket-powered vanes, again, helicopter-like vanes with a ring that would surround them and a cockpit area above and below. So from the side, these would look like a perfect flying saucer. These things had, from the start, had problems with stability. And of course, they went through test pilots at a fairly rapid rate. Well, after about 15 attempts, they evidently got one that ran fairly well. About this time, now we're talking about 1944, Schreiber and Habermas got some orders to drop their project and move to Breslau and assist in another project which was run by Dr. Richard Mita.
I had friends who reported these balls of fire appearing outside of the cockpit of a fighter aircraft only 10 and 15 feet away, and they did every maneuver they could think of, dives and rolls and everything, trying to get rid of this ball of fire out there, and it remained in exactly the same position no matter what they did. We knew that the rockets had been perfected, and we thought that most of these were simply a further extension of this rocket technology, and we believed that they were all being produced someplace by the Germans.
I was amazed to discover a whole side to the German technological development before and during the war that has never been published in the books. The Germans had space flights with about probably 1,000 different vehicles.
This was a little bit different project in that there was no outer group of rotors that spun. This project, you couldn't see anything spinning. the rotors, there were two rotors, but they were housed internally, so it was kind of a cowled helicopter, if you can imagine this, with a cockpit above and below. Also, other alternate engines were proposed for this, among them being the radial jet engines, which at that time many jet engines were radial jet engines, meaning that the exhaust came out the sides rather than a straight tube, and there were many exhaust outlets. So this type of pancake jet engine would of course fit nicely into a saucer, and the jet engines would not only provide thrust where you wanted it, but they could also be used for steering. It's said that on its initial flight it went up to 60,000 feet. The Germans make big claims for speed here. They actually claim this was a supersonic helicopter. As far as the Schriever-Habermohl craft, we have a letter from a test pilot saying he flew one. And he wrote it to one of the living saucer designers that we have located in Germany. So it's sort of a testimonial letter to him saying, yeah, I know who you are a designer, and at least I want to give you credit for it if nobody else will.
English and French got in with Germany first, and they had these fireballs reported over Europe then. They got their name, Foo Fighter, from the French word for fire, few fighter, firefighters, or fireball fighters. And then the Americans adopted it, and then the English did, and everybody called them Foo Fighters after that. Mattern and Heydrich published a book in Canada years ago, it's about 15 years ago, where they described the German disc research program in considerable detail and published a map showing the location of 8 German disc research facilities.
They built a wing version of the V-2 rocket, which could fly twice as long as the usual one. And then they built a manned wing version of that rocket. Anyone who had flown that rocket would qualify for astronauts' wings here in this country, because you can fly higher than 30 kilometers, which is 100,000 feet, and you get the astronauts' wings.
The manned V1 project was, they put a little cockpit on a V1, the buzz bomb. And the idea was that they were going to fly these little buzz bombs and guide them manually, and at the last minute bail out. Well, the problem here was that when they bailed out, they had no ejection seats, so they were going to bail out and try to avoid the incoming jet intake. So these were generally considered suicide missions. Hitler didn't like the idea. He said that the kamikaze style was un-German. He said it wasn't worthy of Germans, and so he canceled the program himself. Well, they had these pilots left over, so they moved them into the Geschwader 200, Squadron 200, was moved into piloting these rather risky UFOs. In late 1944, Schriever and Habermohl returned to Prague to finish work on their type of flying disc. Both of these were called designated V7. This was sort of a competition to get a V7 type craft, which was flying, which was going to, of course, carry rockets and go up after Allied bomber formations, and kind of a flying platform. At that time, the Germans had not only rockets, barrage-type rockets, but they had rockets that were wire-guided with a 2-mile range. So you can imagine this thing carrying up several of these wire-guided rockets and sitting there calmly with little joysticks blowing up bombers. That was the idea. I have a letter from a test pilot. He claims that he tested one for a 250 to 300 kilometer, rides. So, we're talking about certainly over 100 miles of test flights on this thing.
Since the beginning of the UFO phenomenon almost 50 years ago, flying saucers, if they are believed to exist at all, have been thought to originate from an extraterrestrial source. But there is a growing body of evidence that offers a more earthly explanation.
The electromagnetic projects were really 2 in Germany, one being called the Vril project, that's V-R-I-L, and the Haunebu project. Haunebu is an occult term having to do something with the column or tree of life supporting the heavens, which is normally thought of being in the polar regions. It's something to do with arcane mythology. The Vril craft, according to one of our sources, is an occult-based electromagnetic project. And what I mean by that is this Vril society that was doing the experimenting with this craft in the late 30s, or the middle 30s, was not looking to build a flying saucer. They were looking to communicate with ancient gods.
Remember that about 100 years ago, if we were going from London to the United States, we'd do it in a tall sailing ship. And it might take us 6 weeks to 8 weeks to get across the ocean. That was the state of the art then. Well, we didn't build faster boats, did we? We invented the airplane. Now we go to London in 6 to 8 hours from New York. We still don't have ships that go that fast. We came up with a whole new kind of technology. There was a whole new kind of technology developed by the Germans in 1920 on Earth. They developed a better airplane. They figured out a way of using magnetic field energy and created metal flying discs. And they almost had those sophisticated enough to use them 60 years ago in World War II, but they didn't. If they had, we'd probably all be speaking German about now. There have been breakthroughs in technology, and that next major breakthrough in technology, magnetic field energy, has already happened, but they don't want to unleash that. The governments and the military are very worried about that because that knowledge, fallen into the wrong hands in second and third world countries, could probably rapidly bring forward World War III much faster than we need to. We don't need that kind of knowledge commonly known. We like to think that our airplanes, our Boeing 747s or our F-16 fighters are the state of the art of science on planet Earth. They are not. And once you kind of stop for a second and consider that, oh my gosh, maybe the U.S. military isn't the most advanced thing on the planet. And then you can think, well, maybe somebody else just found a different way of building an airplane.
These were private, basically secret society financed and owned technologies primarily.
Information was channeled to these occultists, essentially, in the Vril Society, on how to build a machine to make it possible to communicate with the god, to be in the presence of the gods, is I think the way they put it. They built a machine. They actually had a scientist in their midst, in their membership, Dr. W.O. Schumann, who was a world-class scientist in electrical engineering. Built a device which looks like it rotated. In other words, it looks sort of like an electric motor. It had rotating parts. The interesting thing about this device is, I don't know whether it did anything for time or space or dimensional shifting, but what it did was it levitated. It rose up off the floor. So the Vril people began, of course, naturally got excited about that alone. According to the story, as it's told in Germany and Austria, the craft was then dismantled and moved to Augsburg. The craft was then, further worked and experimented on, and a whole series of these Vril craft were built, a whole series of prototypes, culminating in the Vril 1, which was a small fighter-type craft, an electromagnetically powered, designed by the Schumann Group, Dr. Schumann, who worked with SSE-4 as a technical division of the SS. This craft was capable of traveling 2,500 miles an hour, so we're talking about beyond speed, way beyond speed of sound. And in their pictures, the pictures that we have of this craft, which look good, you can see, they're so close you can actually see the pilot sitting in the cupola, the cockpit of the craft. This craft had remote-controlled machine guns, which may or may not have been too effective, 2 types of machine guns. It also was scheduled to have a laser weapon.
Well, it appears at the time that German postgraduate scientists doing research at the University of Vienna became interested in the metaphysical library at the university there, which is one of the biggest in Europe. It was that group of pragmatic scientists that set themselves up, organized themselves into what they called the Tool Society. They were communicating with discarnate and possibly extraterrestrial intelligence and getting information. group members that thought alike separated themselves from the rest of the Thule group and organized themselves into the Vril Society. The Vril Society grew quite fast, rapidly attracting a lot of scientists, middle-level scientists and senior scientists to it also, and they began trying to produce craft similar to the discs that were being observed. Then within that group, another cell emerged of inner people that called themselves the Society of the Black Sun. And it was the members of the Black Sun Society, which became the SS Society. That's the symbol for the black sun. It's a black sun with the black rays shooting out of it and white SS in it, lightning strokes in it. And the SS became the instruments of reduction of the population.
A recently declassified CIA document from 1950 indicates that our government suspected that most UFOs were made from machines based on advanced German technology. The Allied governments had divvied up top-secret German files on a first-come, first-served basis at the end of the Second World War. Who had the flying disc blue book?
Well, actually, before the war ended, the United States and the Soviets, and to a lesser extent the British and the French, began scouring occupied Europe for German scientists. They initially were looking for nuclear scientists. And of course then they also rocket scientists. And of course they ended up taking just about anybody they thought would be of value to them. For instance, they tried to recruit and later did recruit Victor Schauberger, who was working on models of saucers for the Germans built that flew under a totally different principle. He observed fluids in motion, specifically water, and came up with sort of a tornado spiral type of engine, which many people think of as being a free energy engine. Schriever got invitations to work in the United States. He also got invitations to work in South America from Nazis that didn't want to surrender, essentially it's the SS. And he chose not to do either and spent his remaining days, he died rather young in the early 1950s, delivering Stars and Stripes newspapers on trucks to Allied air bases or Allied bases in occupied Germany. Now this may seem funny, but Stars and Stripes delivery personnel were used extensively by the SS to smuggle people out of Germany.
They were basically kept in low profile. They were preparing a dash for the South Pole to the colony that they've been quietly building up from the late 30s. Mm-hmm. And after 42, when everybody in Germany understood that they were about to lose the war, they would be slowly choked down. They started building that colony at full blast. By the time the war ended, they had about between 100,000 and maybe several 100,000 evacuees there. Elite troops, scientists, engineers, children from the Hitlerjugend to be the seed of the new colony.
They began decentralizing German industry. It went to mostly to Central and South America. Sent some factories and materials to their New Schwabenland, which was New Germany, as a matter of fact. Schwabenland is what Germany was called before we called it Germany. In Antarctica, the first mission was undertaken to Antarctica to New Schwabenland was headed by Goering, Hermann Goering, in 1936, when he took a fleet of cargo ships and submarines, cargo submarines down there. By 1939, they had an established operating base there. So by 1943, when they have to decentralize and get their most advanced research, they're trying to get it out of Germany so it doesn't fall into our hands. And that includes the disc research.
The other electromagnetic project was a derivative, to a large extent, of the Vril project and used many components. It's called the Haunebu project. And here, there may have been some infusion of technology from Victor Schauberger and his work, and also infusion of technology of the ancient Indians. Couple this with the Vril technology, this produced the Haunebu type of saucer that we would call a flying saucer or a UFO today would be easily recognizable by any of us. After the war, by the way, these craft weren't that great as weapons for a couple of reasons. You couldn't steady them because of the magnetic field these things would generate. They would tend to wobble a little bit, like, you know, unsteady, like kind of like a cork bobbing in water. Well, the Adamski craft, the Germans say, are Haunebus. That the Adamski took great pictures of Haunebus. I'm sure we had various models of German saucers. Certainly the conventionally powered saucers we had rebuilt by that time. We're not talking very complicated. We're just talking about a lot of work putting these things together, like building a house. It's not complicated, you just have to do the work. The electromagnetic ones were certainly more complicated, but were seen in the area in probably 50 or 51, certainly by a great number of people. So they were around then in the very early 50s, if not the late 40s.
Our post-World War history has been riddled with secrets and government cover-ups. But could an international conspiracy of this magnitude be hidden for 50 years? If UFOs are man-made, then we are looking at an international cover-up of staggering proportions. Is it paranoia or terrible truth?
One quite prominent, in fact, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist told me 5 years ago, he said, Whitley, if one word of this book is true, science has taken a kick in the shins because we've been lied to. He said to me 3 days ago, science took a body blow. We've been lied to, more than lied to. He said, I'm beginning to suspect I'm looking at one of the most evil things that has ever been done on this planet. And that is the concealment of the greatest secret that mankind has ever known. I said, you're jumping to the conclusion that it's aliens. And he said, of course it's aliens. I said, wait a minute. Let's be clear about this. Don't do that. It's implants right now. It's crop circles. It's video. We don't know if it's aliens yet. Let's look through the implants, the video, and the crop circles and see what's on the other side of that. Then we can decide if it's aliens.
When we return, what the Air Force was seeing nearly 50 years ago.
Whenever a country was overrun, there's a whole branch of the service that does nothing but collect the technical information. There were trucks with drivers waiting to be backed up to the factory facilities where the soldiers that were overrunning the place were looting the files and bringing them out to the trucks and loading them, and they hauled them away. Within hours of the fall of a town, all of the technical material in the factories that supported the operation was being hauled away. And that was all collected and shipped back to the United States for study. Now, we collected it because we wanted to see what they had been doing. We also wanted to see what they were going to do, what their future plans were, see if they were running ahead of us or behind us. And if there was anything in development that we didn't know anything about, we quickly began a study of it. We were all doing this. The French were doing it, the British were doing it, the Australians were doing it, everybody was doing it. And if we had been conquered by anybody else, that would have happened to all of our documents or records. They would have all gone elsewhere.
The story, of course, is that, 30 countries are working on UFOs or UFO-like craft. Dr. Mita worked in North Africa, in Pakistan, and in all places Israel before coming to the United States.
The UFO phenomena itself is multi-causal, and we're having trouble understanding it because we don't face up to that fact. For example, I studied vehicle interference reports. It was my first general huge project in ufology in the 70s. And there's a class of reports that involve car stopping, vehicle interference reports, that are little orange balls of light, little red and orange balls of light. They look like ball lightning, but they don't act like ball lightning. And they're a little bit bigger than ball lightning, and they hang around for longer than ball lightning, but they don't look like alien spacecraft either. And there's another part of it that I'm convinced in the last 10 or 15 years at least has been secret government aircraft, at least in this country. I don't think necessarily South America or someplace, but more and more the government is flying remotely piloted vehicles that have strange shapes, You know, the Israelis in the Middle East, you never hear about this, of course, because it's top secret. Every day the Israelis fly strange-shaped planes over all the Palestinian areas in the West Bank. They fly it over Lebanon, and they're remotely piloted vehicles, basically to take pictures to see what the Palestinian rebels are up, and the rebels are up to. And the United States will do this. They did the same in the Gulf War, and you never heard about it because this is more secret than the stealth fighter. These devices, because they're so effective. Well, if they're testing these things out west, obviously we may in fact be seeing some of these things and think they're UFOs. Then, of course, there's a third category of UFOs, which might look like flying discs and might be alien spacecraft. I'm absolutely convinced, like almost all scientists are, that there's life in the universe, teeming with intelligent life. And I believe that it can get here, and it could happen any day, and it doesn't have to even be what we've been experiencing here. For example, Jacques Vallée says UFOs are real, they are not alien spacecraft. Okay, that's what those are the two fundamentals, I think, of his position. They're real, they're not alien spacecraft. Let's say he's right, but maybe tomorrow the alien spacecraft will be here, and I think it's inevitable. In fact, that's I guess my fundamental point here. It is inevitable that we will contact alien life someday. The only question is, when will it openly occur? Maybe it's already, of course, occurred secretly, but when will it openly occur?
Waking abruptly in the night, paralyzed, terrified, surrounded by alien creatures. Abducted and taken where? A laboratory? Spaceship? Laid out on a table and probed, surgically embedded with implants. Is this reality, or is it a nightmare from beyond?
What happened to me first was in Christmas of 1985. I had a shocking close encounter that left me completely undone because it appeared to be an encounter with aliens. It was very violent and totally unexpected. Came into the middle of a life that was basically unrelated to the UFO phenomenon in any way. I spent months trying to understand what had happened to me from a medical standpoint, and eventually concluded that it was unexplained. I was very frightened by it and began to go out into the woods in the middle of the night to confront those fears. The result of this was that the visitors returned to my life, and that began what has turned out to be a 10-year relationship with them. During that period of time, so much has happened outside of my experience. Along the lines of first the crop circles began to come, things like the Mexican UFO videos began to be made. Now they're extracting implants from people. There's so much physical evidence of something strange going on that in 1986 I thought I had a medical problem. By 1989 I was fairly sure it was some kind of hallucinatory thing. Now, in 1996, if this isn't dead on real, I'll eat my hat. I have one question left. Who's doing this? Aliens or people? I don't know the answer yet. But I think that the presence of implants like the one I have in my own earlobe means all bets are off. This is real. It's physical. But what is it?
Disturbing stories of alien abduction are beginning to sound all too familiar. Missing time, bizarre medical experiments, post-traumatic stress. In America alone, over 1 million people have claimed to be abducted.
We can date this back to the turn of the century with a fairly high degree of accuracy and certainty. Anything past that, and we really lose sight of it. It's generational, it's intergenerational, it goes back to great-grandma or great-grandpa or something like that, we think. Well, they say that they're taken out of the normal environment, they're rendered powerless, they cannot fight back, they can't say no, they can't say, not tonight, I've got a headache, or anything like that. They're taken on board a UFO, their clothes are removed, they're placed on a table, they have a series of mental, physical, and reproductive procedures that are run on them. There's primary, secondary, and ancillary procedures that are also run, which might be seeing babies, holding strange-looking babies, or seeing incubator rooms with hundreds of columns filled with fetuses in them, or they might have visualization procedures where they're made to envision all sorts of things, which might be disaster scenarios or middle-class, mundane suburban life scenarios, and then they're returned to their normal environment and they forget what happened to them immediately. They are not made to forget about it. In other words, we would expect to find a procedure which basically says you will not remember, you will not remember, you will forget, you will forget. And we'd expect to see it every single time. We never see it, have never seen it ever. It's not there. So in fact, what happens is there's a certain consciousness and perceptual alteration that occurs at the beginning of the phenomenon, which goes all the way through it, and that consciousness alteration ultimately is responsible for the amnesia that takes place. So the best way you can say it is that the memories are stored in an area which are not accessible through normal recall, but which are accessible through relaxed or focused concentration. Hypnosis is one way, and there are other ways of getting it as well.
I woke up one morning and walked into the kitchen to prepare breakfast and remembered what had happened during the previous night, little bits and pieces. I remembered that during the night I was lying in a round room, lying flat on my back on some kind of a table or platform, sort of like an examining table in a doctor's office. And I remembered that several entities that looked all alike, exactly like each other in every way, were standing around me performing medical experiments on me. And I remembered what they looked like. They had big, huge black eyes, no pupils, no white. They had no hair. They had just two little holes for a nose. I can't remember their mouth at all. I just don't remember. They didn't have any ears, and they were real slender and an off-white color. I call them a chalky color. And they were somewhere between 4 and 5 feet tall.
This is a reproductively oriented phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that's not interested in our defenses, not interested in atomic installations. They're not checking out the flora and the fauna. This is a reproductively oriented program. It is not a study. It is not an experiment. If there were any studies or experiments, they were done a long time ago. We don't see anything even vaguely relating to that, never have. We see a program.
I did not consciously remember at that point in time how I got on board the craft or how I left. And the only part of being on the craft that I remember was when I was lying on my back. But I remember that the room was round, which I thought was strange. You know, I didn't see any corners like we have. And that's all I remembered at that time about that experience. But now, we have to put this in context here. In the late 70s, I'd never heard or read anything about abduction experiences. So even though that experience seemed as real to me as any other conscious, awake aspect of my life, I had no context in which to put it. Never having been taught about abductions in school or church, never having it mentioned by anybody, I didn't know how to handle that experience. So I said, well, you know, I've never heard of this thing happening to anybody, even though it seemed so very, very real. It must have been a dream. It happened during the night, so therefore, it must have been a dream. And that's how I rationalized it all.
I was thinking about abduction cases more in the late 80s, maybe 87 or 88, because they were becoming so prominent. And so many people were doing investigations. David Jacobs, for example, first turned to abduction cases about that period. Well, what I realized is two things. First is that no one was studying the abductee in a scientific fashion. We were studying the abductee's story. Lots of people were recording the story. But I was interested in who they were, psychologically, sociologically, and so forth. And the second was that I was trained to do work in those areas. My PhD is in sociology. And I knew a couple people who work with the center who would be a good asset for a study of abductees and their characteristics. For example, we're getting slightly more females than males, which most people, we get the same percentage, but not overly, you know, not overtly 9 to 1 or something, but a few more females than males. We're getting many more whites than you would expect in population. And I think that has a lot to say about the cultural aspects of UFOs, more so than what aliens might be doing. Otherwise, they're very normal in terms of their education, actually slightly higher educated than the populace as a whole. Very much otherwise just what you'd expect in terms of where they live and their jobs, you know, and everything like that. So they're fairly normal with a few differences like I've mentioned. Psychologically, it's a little more interesting. Most of them are what we'll use the word normal in quotes. Most of them are normal. About 20% are not. Of those 20%, they show a diverse group of syndromes or symptoms or characteristics, with the schizoid personality possibly being the most common of those. But that does, even putting those aside, that leaves 80% of the people we've talked to or worked with as being basically normal, okay? Not having any characteristics that would lead you to say, oh, that characteristic must be why they say they're an abductee, okay? Also, we looked in the fantasy-prone hypothesis and found out that it doesn't wash. Again, a very small percentage, maybe 10%, are what you call fantasy-prone, but the vast majority are not. Nor are they necessarily highly hypnotizable. There's a test you can use for that, and we found that most of them fall within the normal range of that, which means they're not particularly susceptible to being led under hypnosis, which is always one of the important questions people raise. And we looked at other characteristics as well, just odd psychological characteristics like out-of-body experiences. That's one thing we found that's interesting, is that most of these abductees do have out-of-body experiences. Now, the population as a whole is about 10 to 15% say they've had an out-of-body experience. Our abductee population is 60%.
And I woke up, and I remember sitting up from my waist up, and there was something holding my legs, holding onto my legs, and I lifted up, and my legs were spread apart, and there were 3 small gray beings around my legs. And I always interpreted it as being something sexual because that's where they were, but no other clue beyond that. I woke up and I sat up and I looked at them at very close range, and the next memory I have was floating out the window and going up, and it was cold, and went to a craft, a gray metallic craft that was above the house, not too far above, and it had a humming noise to it, and in the roundness of the craft, I remember the roundness of the craft as I was going up, the metallic gray, a humming noise, and the color. Went into the craft and have no memory of anything happening in the craft until I was leaving. And as I left, there was a tall, blonde, 8 foot. Now, if I'm off 6 inches, I'm off. But I looked up at him, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, he had long blonde hair and was wearing white, and said, "Do not be afraid of the unknown."
Coming up, more stories of alleged alien contact.
I had experiences that I remember just little bits and pieces of, like I might remember a force field taking me out of the house, or having me lying horizontally over my bed, and I started having flashbacks of the big black eyes staring into my eyes. I think it's possible that I was having experiences periodically throughout that entire period of time, but something was blocking my memory. The way I relate it to my ET experience is that I believe that our government military have erased portions of my memory intentionally.
Woke up in the middle of the night, and I was awakened by the fact that I felt like I was in motion. And I turned out to be in a little room full of what looked to me like gigantic insects, which were peering at me. I thought it was a nightmare, and I kept trying to wake up from the nightmare, but the nightmare was happening while I was awake. I was not home in my bed anymore. I was in an entirely different place. And they fired a needle into the side of my head. They did a rectal probe into my body. There was a voice, like an electronic voice, going, "What can we do to help you stop screaming?" It was an appalling experience. It was indistinguishable from real life, except as I understood real life at that time, it was something that couldn't happen. That was the first experience. Subsequently, there were many different types of experience, close approaches, encounters, other abductions that eventually led to a situation that I live in now, where there's a very formal structure to the encounters, and they come only at particular moments, like I needed some information for the last chapter of the book I'm writing. I needed it from the visitors. There was no one else who could give it to me. There was an encounter, and I received the information I needed for the book. That's the kind of thing that happens now. In other words, it's become communication. At first, it was just dead-on attack. Now it's much more communicative. My fear at that time, even while I was having the experience, was primarily not a fear of them, but a fear of the fact that I could not get out of this, because I thought I had become psychotic and that I could not escape from a hallucinatory horror. Of course, the thing is, it was not a hallucination. That's very clear to me now. It's been 10 years of questioning and searching for me to come to the point where I would say that. However, you can't not say that now. There's too much evidence that someone is here. And the reason I've changed my position so much over these past few years, implants are being physically taken out of people. We don't know whether or not, if you got past all of the interference, you wouldn't find soldiers putting it into her. Or it might be there really are aliens out there doing it. We just can't be sure of anything right now. This is a time not for answers, but for questions.
Is it possible you could be driving in your car and then suddenly compelled to turn down a road you've never seen before? You have the sensation that something is pulling you, drawing you to a clearing where a strange aircraft hovers near the ground. Aliens greet you, call you by name. They seem to know everything about you, but for some reason, you're not afraid. You board the spaceship, fly off to another planet, and then later return safely to Earth. Good evening and welcome to From Beyond. I'm Joey Travolta. Stories of alien contact seem unbelievable, and the contactees are usually passed off as cons or crazy. But should they be dismissed so easily? Tonight we'll take a closer look.
My present position of thinking, line of thinking, is that we've been visited by extraterrestrial entities for a long time, maybe as long as our history, and maybe even as long as humanity has been on this planet. And maybe we were brought here by them. It's a long, ongoing, extended phenomenon. It's not an event that happened recently. We only have the modern wave of it being reported at the present time.
I'm absolutely convinced, like almost all scientists are, that there's life in the universe, teeming with intelligent life. And I believe that it can get here, and it could happen any day, and it doesn't have to even be what we've been experiencing here. For example, Jacques Vallée says UFOs are real, they are not alien spacecraft. Okay, that's what those are the two fundamentals, I think, of his position. They're real, they're not alien spacecraft. Let's say he's right, but maybe tomorrow the alien spacecraft will be here. And I think it's inevitable, in fact. That's, I guess, my fundamental point here. It is inevitable that we will contact alien life someday. The only question is, when will it openly occur? Maybe it's already, of course, occurred secretly, but when will it openly occur?
There are really two kinds of contactee subcultures in a sense. There was the one that began in Southern California in the 1950s and went on until it petered out sometime in the 60s, was composed in great part of people who claimed actual physical contact with extraterrestrials. And they provided photographs and films of what were represented as spaceships, but which were all too clearly small objects, models. The belief was that there were selected Earthlings who were in regular communication with space people. They were often called space brothers. They were angelic beings, usually with long blonde hair and almost sort of androgynous features, really kind of angels in spacesuits, basically. And that the universe was densely populated, mostly by advanced, benevolent civilizations with an occult philosophy. There was also belief that there was a minority of civilizations in the universe that were demonic, that were really evil, and that they had earthly allies. And the good space people were, among other things, trying to stop the designs of the bad space people. And also, the good space people were trying to prevent Earthlings from blowing themselves up with atomic bombs.
During the late 40s and early 50s, as many people are aware, we were going through a great technological stage of advancement here in this country and around the world. We were coming to the advent of the nuclear age, and we were rapidly progressing in our scientific capabilities. However, we seemed to be very slow in our sociological parallel of that scientific advancement. When these craft came to visit us in the late 40s, they were greatly concerned with what we were doing atomically to this planet. We were testing our hydrogen bombs on the surface, in the atmosphere, and we were, for the first time, set up in a condition where we literally had the capability of destroying this planet. And some of these crafts and these people came to inform us that we need to be very aware of what we were doing with this technology, and through our ignorance that we wouldn't destroy ourselves in the process. This is one of many reasons why they came to visit us during that time frame and continue to visit us to this day.
People like Adamski, George Van Tassel, Orfeo Angelucci, Daniel Fry, some of the other leading players in the drama of 1950s contactee movement, were their allies on Earth. Adamski's followers called him Earth's cosmic ambassador. And these were the prophets. These were the Earthlings who were here to spread the message to all who would hear. And these guys came from a wide variety of backgrounds and varying levels of sincerity. None of them was telling the literal truth. But some of them were fudging the truth, or more likely inventing out of whole cloth, out of what were basically benign intentions. They had a sincere and mostly benevolent message. You know, people should be nice to each other. They shouldn't blow each other up. You know, these things that you know, all human beings are brothers and sisters. I mean, things that, you know, you're not going to disagree with, and that would be good if everybody believed and acted on. But at the same time, there were other guys who were just sort of veteran swindlers, con artists, sociopaths, people who just saw it as a new way to hustle something.
Only as the 70s turned into the 80s and the 90s have we now all become convinced, or most of us, that UFOs are real extraterrestrial spacecraft. And so, but you know, why has that occurred? That's an interesting question. I mean, I think it should be investigated. I think you can speculate along many lines. One is that just the fact there were UFO sightings just kept occurring. I mean, just reinforced this thing in the public's mind. Oh, yeah, UFOs might be real, might be extraterrestrial spacecraft. The space program is a second factor, obviously. Got us all interested in space. The third is that astronomy has become more of an interesting discipline with satellites and you know, space telescopes and all those kinds, and radio telescopes searching for extraterrestrial life with Carl Sagan. So that's a whole other area. Fourth area, movies, science fiction, of course. You know, the 1950s thing starting it, because before that, science fiction was pulp novels, amazing stories, and it was a small segment, I think, of the population. But then in the 50s, it burgeoned. So I think all those things enter into it, and I think that the reason the public believes, the fundamental reason, is that it's reasonable to believe. You know, that we all think that there's life out there, and that, hey, why not?
Yeah,
you know, is
led by
essentially.
astronomers, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. So why not? Why, you know, and the only difference, in fact, that the public has with scientists is that scientists think alien life exists and it's all far away, and the public thinks alien life exists and part of it's here.
George Adamski, founder of the contact movement, enlightened messenger, con artist, respected researcher, liar. He's been called all of these things. The controversy began in 1952 when Adamski, middle-aged and leading seemingly an uneventful life, emerged from a California desert claiming to have met a spaceman.
George Adamski was, along with George Van Tassel, the most influential figure in the early contactee movement. And whereas Van Tassel was claiming, at least initially, channeled messages from extraterrestrials, Adamski claimed to have met them physically, beginning with an incident in the desert of Southern California on November 20th, 1952, which supposedly was witnessed from some considerable distance by 6 of his most trusted associates. And Adamski wrote several books. He first really came on the scene by co-authoring with Desmond Leslie, who was an Irish occultist, a book called Flying Saucers Have Landed, which came out in 1953. And this was the first full account of Adamski's initial meeting with a Venusian named Orthon.
George Adamski could be considered really the pioneer in the UFO field. He was by no means the only person who had taken photographs of UFOs, but he was one of the very few who went out publicly and submitted his photographs to many agencies, many different laboratories, and really brought this subject out into the forefront of investigations into why these crafts are visiting us and the message that they bring. And primarily he started taking first pictures in the late 40s. He had a number of contacts in the middle 1950s in front of witnesses in which this craft landed in the desert, and the occupants, human beings, came out and they communicated for minutes, and then they flew back off into their craft into space. And this repeated itself many times during the 50s and early 60s. This is one of the few surviving pictures from the original contact in November of 1952, and you can just see the shape of the scout craft or bell-shaped craft as it comes above the hill out in Desert Center as it's taking off into space. This was after Mr. Adamski had face-to-face contact with the human being who had come out as the pilot of this craft.
The photographs were created. In fact, at one point, somebody who was close to Adamski, a guy named Gerald Baker, actually saw the model. Baker was a young guy who was close to Adamski in 52 and 53 and personally witnessed many of the things that went on, and later, spilled the beans to a skeptical ufologist, James Moseley. He also said that the initial contact, the November 20th, 1952 incident, was carefully rehearsed before they went out into the desert. And everybody knew what he was supposed to say. And yet, it's, in the end, we really will never know exactly what happened. You know, I don't think it's the literal truth of Adamski's claims is in any way defensible. Those things simply didn't happen. But something happened. You know, something human happened, and human behavior can be as enigmatic as the most mysterious UFO events. And I think that in Adamski we're dealing with a human mystery. It's not only the mystery of Adamski's real motivation, but also the mystery of what happens to you when you enter some kind of milieu in which miraculous things are claimed and maybe even experienced on some level.
Coming up, more stories of alleged alien contact. In 1977, William Herman had several opportunities to photograph strange craft that trailed airplanes and flew in erratic patterns over Charleston, South Carolina. On March 18th, he was out looking for these UFOs when a disc suddenly appeared. It swooped toward him, paralyzing him with a beam of blue light. When he regained consciousness 3 hours later, he was alone in a field 15 miles from home.
He and his wife were at home after supper one time when a neighbor lady came to the door to borrow a cup of sugar. And as his wife looked out over the neighbor lady's head, she saw the pinkish orange light, which she recognizes now too. She's seen it enough times, she knows what it is. It's Bill's friend. So he says, Bill, your friend is out here. And he came and looked. He says, by golly, it is. He said, I think I'll get my jacket and go out and take a better look at it. It was flying what they have now recognized as a peculiar triangular pattern along the power lines that run down the Ashley River there. And so he got his jacket on and binoculars, put them around his neck, and walked out the door in his little trailer park where his trailer home was parked, and across a shallow, nearly dry, damp ditch and up onto a railroad track that ran about 10 or 15 feet above the level of the trailer park. He got up on the track and started walking down the track, watching it flying these triangular patterns over the power lines ahead of him, probably 2 or 3 miles away, which is not in the air, that's not very far. And he had his binoculars out looking at the object when it dropped out of the binoculars. It dropped like a stone. And he lowered the binoculars to see where it crashed, and he saw it just over the water of the Ashley River at water level, and he thought, oh my God, it's crashed right into the river. When at that point it approached and filled the sky like that. And it came so fast and so big and so close, he shied back like that and caught his foot on the rail of the railroad track and began to fall. And he put his hands out to see what, there's a jagged rocks down there, you can get skinned up pretty good to see what he was falling on, and he noticed he was not falling, he was rising away from the rocks. And the reeds, tall grass was blowing away from him in waves. And he looked back, and he's above the railroad track, and he's going up in a blue beam of light.
I was about like this, just looking at it, and then I just fell backward like this. Yeah. And at this point, I stopped falling. Oh. That's what I couldn't understand, because I like this, and then the light was all the way around me, and I went to push my hand through, and I couldn't. I couldn't move. Yeah, right at this spot. Right at this spot. Because the object filled the area from that bush to that bush. It just filled the area. The light came from looked like it came from the edge. Didn't come. At first I thought it came from the bottom, but after the hypnosis and after the recall, I realized that it didn't come so much from the bottom as it did from the edge of the object. The rim, around the rim.
He said that the light felt like a low voltage electrical current, just like that, a cyclic tugging up the beam of light until, and he looked up, and it looked like it went into a cloud. The beam was so coherent, he put his arm out, and the arm went out of the beam, and he could pull it back in. It's in the beam again. He didn't touch anything going through. And he rose up, and when he got to the end of the cloud, he passed out, and woke up on an examining table. And that's the time in between. He didn't remember anything. Of course, when he first came back, he didn't remember a whole lot of that either. That took time to develop the details by stressing his memory to get it.
First thing I remember looking at was this bar of lights flashing slowly above my head. Now this is what the bar of lights look like. Laying on a table, and your head is up here, and you're looking up. You see blue, green, red, blue, green. Green, blue, red, green, blue. You know, back and forth. Flash, 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 flash. And it was doing this. And the slower this went, the more conscious I became. The more able to wake up and look around me. What I saw when I woke up, it's hard to really sometimes grasp, but it was like I thought in my mind there were doctors, or I'd been hurt, I'd fallen when I remembered the train tracks. I didn't remember the object as much as I remembered falling with the train tracks. And I remember falling, and I thought, oh, I must have broken my back. Somebody must have found me, and I'm in a hospital. You know, and all these thoughts were racing through my head until the three people that were standing there turned and looked at me. And I had noticed that before they had turned, they were looking at this bar of lights flashing on the ceiling, and they were looking at a box that seemed to be off to the side at my feet. And the box was connected to the bed. You could tell it was connected by wires to the bed I was laying on, or the table, or whatever it was. And when they turned and looked at me, it was like all kinds of emotions just surged to the surface at once. Now this is a sketch of what I believe I saw standing next to my bed, or table, or whatever you want to call it. 4.5 feet tall, with a red garment, looked like a pullover jumpsuit, not pajamas, more military looking. And the eyes were spaced apart like ovals with circles inside, dark circles. And the occupant, when they told me to get up, and it was okay. I heard the voice, but I did not see the lips move. I heard it as clear as you hear my voice.
You heard it in English?
In English. It was in English. Perfect English, not accented, not deep, not high, just English. I felt afraid because I didn't know what was going on. I felt like this is totally foreign to everything I believe. What is going on here? Why am I here? What is this? All these thoughts going through my head, and all he could say was, "Don't be afraid." You know, it's like all my emotions and fears were just tossed aside by the comforting assurance of what he said to me. Just, don't be afraid, have no fear, or something to that effect. Come, the time is limited, or something about like that.
Now more stories of alleged alien contact.
The object itself was like a round pancake shape with a dome on top and a dome on the bottom.
Right.
But it looked sealed in metal. In other words, you didn't see no windows or no holes or nothing. It moved in a circle above, I'd say about 800 to 1,000, maybe 1,500 feet above the ground. And it moved in not as obvious triangles, but kind of in a flowing, graceful, dynamical fashion. I mean, just sliding across the sky, you know. Not doing anything that would give it an impression that it would lose control. In spite of its erratic behavior, you could tell it was in total control of itself. I mean, there was just, it was the most one of the most beautiful displays of aerodynamics I've ever seen, as far as being involved in this subject.
So you tried to take a picture?
I tried. The first shot, I believe the first shot I took came out empty sky. It was moving so fast. I mean, it would go up like this and come back like this. Come around like that. And just watching it was, you know, it was hard. Because when it would go that way, I'd run across the field, and I'm trying to get it in a viewfinder. And I took about 4 or 5 shots like that. And I believe 2 or 3 of them came out, and 2 came out empty sky.
They took him to a control panel and sat him down in one of the seats. His escort, who is speaking to him in his language, he hears it in his language, he hears it in his ears, just like surround sound. And he tells him, look, and they pointed to the screen, and another ship just like the one they were in joined them. And then the two ships went rapidly again south over continents, over countries and continents, topography, geography changing, just like it's unrolling rapidly, and they approached ground again, the surface, down over Argentina. They took him again to an underwater facility in the Rio Sal, which runs out of a big freshwater lake, a big lake in northern Argentina. And the river runs through Santa Fe, a little town, not such a little town, big town of Santa Fe. And his escort standing beside him. Now the escort's not buckled into anything, he's just standing there, and Herman is sitting in a seat, but he's not fastened in either. And the craft he's in tilts down at an angle and goes into the water, and goes under the water. And there's no inertial change to him. He feels no inertial changes, and his partner's still standing there beside him. And the partner touches him on the shoulder and says, "We were observed over Santa Fe. There'll be reports in the paper tomorrow about UFOs." And they went to the underwater facility, and the being explained to him that they installed this facility to carry out certain hydrodynamic tests in our water because our water was different from their water.
On the way back, they showed me the reactions of people observing their craft. And he said, "Walk over here." And I walked up to looked like a cross between an open window and a television set. It looked like a TV in that it was like this, but it looked like an open window that I could just stick my hand through it, is what it looked like. And I looked through the monitor, and you could see there was a road, there was trees on both sides of the road, and it looked like an orange grove or some kind of big field. And there was a road running adjacent to it. And there was two cars pulled over. One was a Pinto station wagon, a Ford Pinto station wagon, and the other one was a Buick Electra. And there was a lady in the Pinto, and there was a man in the Buick. And the lady was standing outside the passenger door looking up like this. And the man was just standing there like this. And I'm standing inside this object looking at that, and it was like it zoomed up on the people. And he says, "Now watch what happens." The one that was next to me, he said, "Watch what happens when we move closer." The minute he said that, you saw the girl. It seemed illogical, but you could tell it was out of fear. She ran around the front of her car and jumped in the passenger side, reached over there and locked her door. The man standing up, he just calmly, looked like he was trying to keep his cool, just sat down and got in the car and locked the door. Now, he says, "Now watch her. She's going to hold the lockdown." And the only indication of any hostility was what he said next when he says, "A foolish gesture if we wish to direct observe."
After the examination, and they're escorting around the ship, as they're starting to walk through the ship, his host, his guide, said that they would like him. He said, "I wonder if you could make some arrangement with your government to release a damaged vehicle and one of our damaged ships and the bodies of our people." And he said, "Oh, I don't have any connections like that. There's nothing I could do for you there. I don't know anybody. I don't have any. I'm a nobody. There's no way I can help you." He said, "Why don't you do it yourself?" And the alien said, "We have tried." They said, "We sent an emissary to try to negotiate a release. They tried to capture the emissary. He successfully escaped, got in his ship, and took off. They tried to shoot the ship down." He said, they're too hostile. We can't deal with them. We're looking for another way." And he said, "Well, how did they crash anyway?" And they told him that they were lost in the western part of your land, they said in quotes, and that the first one they lost was a big surprise to them. And then they noticed that there was a beam, an energy beam, being transmitted in the area there, and they thought that it was a new weapon that we had used against them. And when they lost the second one, they became very concerned because they think we're shooting them down, and they had even gone to the trouble of contacting other associated space traveling intelligences to consult with them on the nature retaliation should take for our hostile actions. And while they were doing this, they noticed that the beam continued to operate, that the weapon continued to fire and was running in a circle for, when it was running, and it wasn't aimed at anybody, and they decided that it was not a weapon, it wasn't what they thought it was. They calculated, though, that the ships went out of control when that beam locked on the ship, on the craft, and stayed on for 90 seconds or more. The computer control system would burn out and it'd go into automatic emergency landing mode. And they didn't have any control of it at all. And they devised a form of shielding, and changed their flight pattern to this sharp angular change in direction that Herman was reporting, so that the radar could not lock on and stay on for 90 seconds or more. It couldn't stay on for more than 2 or 3 seconds. And they didn't lose any more ships after that.
Now more stories of alleged alien contact.
Paul told me on my first visit, and that was what I started with, how did this all begin? And he said that he worked for a power company in California, south of Los Angeles someplace, and that he was checking power lines, and his route was south of Los Angeles along the coast. And he said that he sat down on a beach, a rocky beach, one time. It was a cove to eat a sandwich, and a man walked up to him, came around the big rock and walked up to him on the beach. He was a tall man. He was about 6.5 to 7 feet tall. He was quite a bit taller than Paul. And he introduced himself, gave him a name, which I don't remember, and Paul, he asked him where he's from, and he says, not from around here. He said, I come from elsewhere. He said, if you will step this way with me, I'll show you my vehicle. And Paul walked around the rock with him, and there was a disc-shaped craft hovering a couple of feet off the water. And the guy took Paul by the hand and floated him to the ship. And he was introduced to some others inside, and he just remained there a very short time. He marveled at the fact that it wasn't in the water. They told him that they would see him again, and they let him out. He never saw him again in California, but a year or so later, he relocated to New Mexico, where he worked for the highway department there, and he was driving a survey truck, a pickup truck, and his particular job was to drive the back roads and look for damage to bridges, rural road bridges. And he carried a Polaroid camera to photograph any damage, because it's easier to show the picture than to try to describe it in a lot of words. And he was in this truck right here that he used with the Polaroid camera on the seat when he drove down this dry riverbed, and there's a lot of willows and scrub that grows in there, 30, 40 feet tall. And the road winds around among these, and he came around a turn, and there sat the craft in the sand. There's 3 women and 4 men outside. They invited him aboard, and he went aboard and looked around with them. They talked to him aboard there for about 15 minutes, telling him who they were and how they had been watching him for some time, that he had a special relationship with them, or they had a special relationship with him, that he had agreed to these relationships sometime much earlier, probably before birth. He didn't understand it that way. And that there was a reason why all this was happening to him. And they didn't have any children aboard. He asked them if they had them. They said yes, but not on this craft. That craft came from a larger craft elsewhere in space. They had been coming and going for some time. They said they had other contactees, but they never told him who the other contactees were, and we've never heard of any of them since. They did not encourage him to get any attention over this. They kept a low profile. They did contact him on a frequency of maybe 2 to 3 times a year, and they weren't here all the time. They would come and go. But when they were in the vicinity, they would often make contact with him.
My hypothesis is that these people who are driving these UFOs, or at least the people who designed them, have a technology that's more advanced than ours. I mean, I think that's obvious, that they're more advanced than our technology. Their technology is so advanced that they have figured out a way to artificially warp space-time the way a black hole does, only without all the gravitational effects that rip things apart into their constituent atoms. So that they can actually manipulate. They have some sort of a generator in here so that they can actually produce this field around their craft like a little bubble, a little private universe that they carry around with them, so that they can actually step out of normal space-time into their own private universe and then step back into it at other coordinates. So if that's possible, then they can not only come from all these distant places, but they can also come from parallel universes that coexist with ours and we're not able to see because they're on a different vibrational level or whatever. They can even come, probably, from our own past or our own future. Because as the quantum physicists are telling us now, the past, present, and future are not separate. Our idea of the stream of time is only an artifact of our consciousness. It is our consciousness that's traveling. It isn't that things are happening cause and effect in a linear fashion. It is our consciousness that's doing that. So the past and future actually exist simultaneously with us, and if you're able to warp space-time, you can travel to and from them. Time is not linear. In fact, it doesn't exist. It's just a concept that we use to describe aspects of space-time, and it's an artifact of our consciousness. So this warping of space-time, I think, can explain a great many things about the UFOs.
One day in 1975, suddenly and without explanation, a one-armed Swiss farmer named Edward Billy Meyer jumped on his moped and disappeared into the woods outside his village. He returned saying that he had met extraterrestrials and had pictures to prove it. The photographs showed spaceships hovering in the air, and Meyer was to take hundreds more photos during his alleged meetings with ETs over the next 5 years. Were the photographs fake, part of an elaborate hoax, or was Billy Meyer really in contact with visitors from beyond?
There's a lot of controversy growing around this case, mostly against it. I was willing to take it because of the photographs. I was willing to get involved in it. I'd been exchanging photographs with Lou Zinstag for a number of years. Lou Zinstag lived in Basel, Switzerland. She was a niece of Carl Jung, one of the earlier UFO researchers. She published the first journal on UFOs in Europe, in German, out of Basel. And this event, the first events happened in her own backyard. It didn't take long before she heard about them, within a few months. And she went to see Mr. Meyer at his home in Hinwil at the time, and he explained how it started, and he showed her the pictures, gave her copies of a dozen of them. And she called me after she got home from that, and she said that she had just acquired a few pictures that she thought I really ought to get a look at, that they were uniquely different because of their extreme sharpness and clarity. And she said, she agreed that that usually means that they're suspect, that they're done in a laboratory. But she said, I've been to this man's house. He has no laboratory. He lives in a chicken house with a dirt floor. He doesn't have any money at all. He works as a security guard for a place to live. He gets a small pension from the Swiss government, barely enough to feed his family. Neighbors provide the film for his camera since he took the first pictures. He uses a broken camera that was tossed out by somebody else. She said the lens is jammed just short of infinity. And she said, he has taken these most remarkable pictures. And she said, I'm coming to the States with Timothy Good in another month or so. And she said, if you're going to be there, she said, we'll come by Tucson and I'll show you the pictures. They were, in fact, the best ones I had ever seen up to this time. They were the sharpest, clearest, most beautiful UFO pictures. I decided I've got to go look him in the eye and see for myself how he's doing this. It all started with him when he had been to a metaphysical discussion group where they discussed the Rudive and Constantine experiments in spirit voices. Meyer decided to try this, and he took a tape recorder, which was also a cast-off of somebody else's, and he put a tape in it, and put it in his bedroom, closed the doors and left it, wound it back and tried to listen to it. Couldn't hear anything. He did it a second time, nothing happened. He decided to give it one more try, and then he believed that they were hoaxing the whole thing. So this time, when he wound it back, right at the beginning, when the tape started out, the tape said, Edward, take your camera and go outside. He turned the tape recorder off, picked up his camera, went out and stood outside with it. Nothing was happening. Looked over at his moped, standing on his kickstand there, and decided to get on it. He pushed it, got the motor going, rode down the road, and he rode for, half an hour, just making turns and following his nose, just idly waiting for something to happen. And he ended up in the Frecht Nature Preserve, south of Hinwil. It's a forest game preserve. He heard a humming, whining sound above him, and looking up, he saw a silvery disc-shaped object come out of a cloud and go back into another cloud. And the sound stopped. Then he heard it again, and it came out of the cloud again, and he saw it once more, and it went back in the clouds, and the noise stopped. Then he heard it a third time, and this time it came out and made a deliberate gliding circle, slow gliding circle, down or around over the tops of the forest trees and right down to the meadow where he was standing, and landed in the meadow a few hundred feet from him.
More of the incredible Billy Meyer story when we return. Welcome back. We continue now with the incredible Billy Meyer story.
This time it came out and made a deliberate gliding circle, slow gliding circle, down or around over the tops of the forest trees and right down to the meadow where he was standing, and landed in the meadow a few hundred feet from him. He started running towards it with his camera. He took several pictures of it in its descent. And he started running forward with his camera, and the closer he got, the more he ran into a resistance. He said the resistance felt like standing in a stream with a swift current. And he said the closer I got, the stronger the current got, until I reached a point where I couldn't go any further against the current, and I just sat down on the ground and waited. And then a being came out from behind the craft walking towards him, and he came up to him, and together they walked a few feet back and sat down on the grass, and she identified herself. She said, "You may call me Semyasi." She said, "I'm not from your system here." But she said, "I have a very important message for you, and I want you to remember very carefully." And he said, "I have no recorder or no notebook or pencil to take any notes. How can I record? How can I remember it carefully?" And she said, "Listen closely, and I'll help you to remember it." That's how it all started. And that message was the message pertaining to the decay of our ionosphere caused by industrial gases. And she explained to him that they'd come to him in a neutral country, hoping that the neutral country would take a position on saving the atmosphere, because neither of the Cold War powers were inclined to do so. They were the ones that were doing the exploiting. And they hoped that his government would take a neutral position and seek to stop the action. He said, "I don't have any contact with the government. I can't do anything for you. Why don't you go to them?" And then she told him a very interesting thing. She said, "We have gone to one of your presidents." You know, Switzerland has a presidential council. They elect 5 presidents at a time, and the chairmanship rotates. Every few months they rotate the presidency, the chairmanship of the President's Council. She said, we have approached one of your presidents. He didn't tell his wife, he didn't tell any of his colleagues, he has told nobody, and he's keeping the secret entirely to himself, afraid of the consequences of revealing it. And she said, that's not doing any good. So she said, she said, the reason we're posing the ships to allow you to take such good pictures is so that somebody will want to know who are they, where are they from, and what do they want. And we want your government to take this position. And here is the message I want you to take down for them. And then she dictated it. And when he got home from that meeting, he sat down in his little bedroom and started to write the message. And then it came through automatic. He was trying to remember what they said when it came through automatically in longhand, and he wrote it rapidly, faster than he can write normally, under some kind of control. And he wrote 15 or 20 pages full, and then it stopped. And he had the first message. And then when he looked at it, he realized that he has gotten the entire communication word by word. So the next time he saw her, she came back, he asked her how they did that, and she said, it's a mechanical device. We have a device that records not only the conversation, but the thought processes as well. And she said, that can be tuned to transmit it back to you. And she said, that's what we did. As far as I could tell, you know, from looking at it, there probably were 3 major objectives for Semyasi and her team. The first one, or one of them, and I don't know the order of priority, seemed to be her attempt to get Switzerland to take the lead in trying to head off the destruction of the ionosphere by industrial gases, by stopping the industrial processes that were producing the gases that were destroying the ionosphere. A second one had something to do with the North Sea, because several times in Meyer's contact she was called away urgently and had to break off the contact in the middle of it, send him back to the ground and race off to head off something that was happening in the North Sea area. We never knew for sure what that was. She told him it was no business of his to know anything about it anyway, and she couldn't discuss any of it with him. But we suspected that she was trying to head off the contamination of the bottom of the North Sea by Russian atomic waste dumping. And I don't know how they were doing. They did have contacts in Russia. So that may have been related. The third objective had something to do with something going on in the Yugoslav mountains, and she never would tell him what that was either. And to this day, we don't know what those objectives were. But when they all 3 failed, she and her team went on to other projects in another solar system in the end of 1982.
No single piece of evidence is conclusive, but it can provide a clue. The challenge is to keep an open mind. Thanks for joining us, and see you next week from Beyond.